Hello, welcome to MetaCell's webinar, AI and Life Sciences Today. I'm Stephen Larson, CEO and co-founder of MetaCell. I'm very excited to have everyone in the audience. We had a lot of signups for this session, so really excited for the content today. I'm joined by a group of excellent panelists today to help us navigate this confusing world of AI in the life sciences. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of excitement in this area. I think we're going to have a good time here today. If you're joining us on Zoom, we are going to have some interactive sessions, interactive polls that you'll be able to give us feedback on when we get going here. So we'll want to hear a little bit from you, and your interaction will be really helpful to make this a two-directional discussion. So we'll be doing a round of introductions first. Then we'll be presenting some slide material to sort of stir up the pot. Then we'll go into a QA session where I'll pose some questions to our panelists. And at that point, we would love to also invite you in the audience to submit questions via the Zoom interface that we can pose here as well. So we're keeping it pretty broad. As an organization, MetaCell, we stretch across academia and industry. So we really are wanting to touch on both, and that's reflective of our composition of our panel. So let me go ahead and hand over an introduction to Marianne Martone.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephen, for inviting me to be on this panel, and to the audience for attending. It looks like we have a good number of people. My name is Marianne Martone. I'm a professor of neuroscience at the University of California, San Diego, and I co-lead the Fair Data Informatics Lab there with my colleagues Jeff Greta and Anita Bondrowski. My background is started in neuroanatomy and in microscopy, light and electron microscopy, but I very early on got into the field of neuroinformatics, being able to essentially harness the power of computing in order to help us organize, understand, and integrate and discover new things from the neuroscience data that we have been producing. So I am a big proponent of open data and open databases. I participate in several large consortia running informatics and data services, fair services for them. They include the BICAN, the Brain Imaging Cell Atlas Network, SPARC, which is fielded a repository and developed a sophisticated platform for studies of the peripheral nervous system, especially involving neuromodulation, PRECISE for preclinical traumatic brain injury, and also ReproNIM for reproducible neuroimaging, and the DKNet project for metabolic disease. So I'll talk a little bit about my experiences with AI in those various different projects, and let me now turn it over to Salvador.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for the invitation as well to this exciting event. So my name is Salvador Dura-Bernal. I'm an assistant professor at the State University of New York, Downstate Health Science University. I'm also a research scientist at the Nathan Klein Institute for Psychiatric Research, and I'm the co-director of the Global Center for AI in Mental Health. My lab focuses on developing these very detailed biophysical circuits where we integrate information across many scales, from molecules to cells to circuits and so on. And we try to use them to understand better how the brain works and to understand how different diseases affect the brain and develop potential new treatments.
Awesome. Thank you. And last but not least, let's introduce Rama Shah.
Hi, thank you, Stephen. So my name is Rama. I've been a software engineer for about 10 plus years now. And past 5 years-ish, I've been, transitioned into managing engineering team. Currently, I work at Genmab. It's a biotech company specializing in creation and development of different antibody therapeutics for treatment of cancer. And I'm really excited to talk about how we're currently leveraging AI to accelerate and enhance patient services in different ways. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, panelists, very much. All right, so let's jump into it. I think before we have some material, I'd love it if we could go ahead and start with a poll of the room here. We've got looks like about 67 folks who are filtered in. So if I could ask our back room here to initiate the first poll now. So we're curious about large language model projects specifically in the last 6 months. So curious for folks that are here in the room, has your organization embarked on a project using large language models specifically in the last 6 months? So either answer yes or no, or you have, but it was prior to 6 months ago. So I'm curious about the 6-month time frame. So we'll give it a few moments to have the votes come in. Then I'll ask in about 5 seconds that we show the results for 3, 2, 1. Okay. We see the results. Okay. So it looks like, all right, so interesting split. So about 38% of you have embarked on some project using large language models or have had your organization do that. 51% of you have not, and 11% of you had done, 6 months ago. Okay, cool. So seems like this is relevant. And large language models, of course, are, I think, have been the headliner technology in AI in the last 2.5 years that I think has come to our attention, largely popularized by the massive adoption of technologies like ChatGPT. I think that's been the thing that's put everything on the radar. It's, I think the fastest growing product that has come on a market in a very long time. And I think that has been the signal to everybody across all industries that something different is happening in AI. So thanks, everybody. We'll ask another question in a little bit. But I wanted to actually do a bit of an homage that also serves as an introduction to myself. So I actually studied AI back before it was cool with this gentleman, Patrick Winston. He was the director of MIT's AI lab between 1972 and 1997. And I had the distinct honor to be a master's student with Patrick Winston. And there's a deep history of artificial intelligence at MIT. He was a director after Marvin Minsky, who I think has been more widely known than Patrick Winston. But in the time that I worked with him, he was truly inspiring on the work of the direction that large language models had taken. So Patrick Winston worked on story understanding systems at the time. And unfortunately, he passed away in 2019. So he's no longer with us. And a big loss, I think, to the world. But I would have loved to have talked to him about the current state of large language models today, because he was very much about not only artificial general intelligence, but also understanding intelligence through the lens of biology. And in fact, he was the bridge for me between computer science and neuroscience to sort of go and look and investigate how the actual brain worked in order to understand intelligence. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So this confusing graph picture here is what happens when you take a story understanding system of the kind that Patrick Winston was working on and that I worked together with him on as a master's student, when you try to break down Shakespeare's play Macbeth, okay? And at that time, there's this idea that you want to build a graph out of underlying concepts. So each one of the squares here, which are very, very tiny to read, but they're little statements of fact that you might derive from reading the play Macbeth. So there's a box here that says Lady Macbeth is Macbeth's wife. Macduff is Lady Macduff's relation. And the different colored blocks relate to having a logical or causal relationship between these statements. So a system may take a lot of text and then try to make some inferences about what may be true. given a formal understanding of logic, a first order logic understanding of concepts and causality. And so in this system, these are explicitly coded into the system. The idea that you have causal relationships between ideas is an explicit part of this system. And so, in one of the latest papers that that Winston published around 2015, you were able to get a story summarization that looks something like this. When you had Macbeth with post hoc ergo prompt hoc processing added, which was an additional feature of his system. The summarization was, the story is about Pyrrhic victory. Lady Macbeth is Macbeth's wife. Lady Macduff is Macduff's wife. Lady Macbeth persuades that Macbeth wants to become king, and so forth. So this kind of a summary took a lot of effort of an explicit graph representation of a story, right? Of nouns, verbs, what follows from what. All these concepts were kind of baked into to the story summarization system that Patrick Winston made. And so I think this is very interesting when we think about what is possible with ChatGPT, because I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of the underlying technologies that are very much not what Winston had settled on, but is very much what is driving innovation in AI right now. And I'm going to use this as a metaphor to talk about life sciences and AI and what's possible going forward. So bear with me here. But the thing to understand about this is that there was a time in which story summarization was done with a very explicit representation of concepts, and we've had a lot of success with systems that have moved away from that. So I want to touch on 3 concepts today really quick that I think are going to be very useful to you all in the audience in order to understand where we're going with AI in the next 5 to 10 years. These are the underlying concepts. The details may change, the data that we train on may change, the applications may change, but these are, I think, some of the most portable ideas that we've found. And this is kind of going in order of things that you probably heard of to things that are more obscure and a little bit more in the weeds that you may not have heard of. So I'm going to start with foundation models. Okay, so foundation models are these large-scale models that are trained on vast amount of data and are fine-tuned for specific tasks. They serve as a base for a lot of downstream applications. So on the NVIDIA blog, all right, there's this picture that I think helps to summarize the idea of what a foundation model is. So ChatGPT is, of course, a service and a product, but underneath it, there is a foundation model that is trained, and that is kind of the core IP. There are now open source foundation models. For example, Meta has released many incarnations of Llama, and Llama 3.1 is essentially approaching the kind of quality that you get in ChatGPT in terms of reasoning. It's pretty close or pretty competitive on that. So that is basically a really big file, but under the hood, how do you get there? Well, you train it with a lot of data. And so on the left-hand side here, you can train foundation models with text, you can train them with images, you can train them with speech, you can train them with other structured data, biology data, you can train them with 3D signals. There's a lot of training, and this is where a lot of compute happens to do the training. And when you do that, then these foundation models can give you, as an output, a lot of very useful task performance. Story summarization is one of them, right? But in addition, what we are familiar with ChatGPT is kind of a dialogue of answering questions. Other things like analyzing sentiment, extracting information, captioning images, recognizing objects, and following instructions are also possible. Okay, that's a foundation model. The second important concept for everybody is to understand is transformers, okay? Not the robots from the 80s and then rebooted in the 2000 movies, but in fact, an underlying machine learning technology that was brought to the attention of the larger academic community in great form in a 2017 paper called Attention is All You Need. And this paper is sort of widely credited with the new wave of what's possible in generative AI. So transformers are a deep learning model architecture. And they were, again, popularized in NLP, which is natural language processing, and sequence modeling tasks. So real quick, A transformer as a black box is something that takes some input, like a French sentence, a statement, and turns it into something else, like an English statement. Okay. If you open that box up a little bit, there's a combination of taking in the input step an encoder box and plugging it into a decoder box in order to get that output. You open up those two boxes and you find that the encoders are organized in layers of neural networks, essentially, which are then also fed into outputs of the decoder, which is also split into multiple layers. In this diagram, there's 6. There's nothing magical about 6. It was what was used in that first paper. Larger and smaller stacks are also possible. And then if you open up those things inside, what's going on inside the encoders, there's still yet another level of granularity where you have a layer of the encoder that's doing self-attention, and then you have a feed-forward layer. And on the decoder side, you have a layer of self-attention, and then encoder and decoder attention, and then finally a feed-forward layer. So if you're not of this field, what should you take away from all of these boxes? It's to basically understand that the transformer is sort of the algorithmic innovation that has given birth to all of these things. Underneath that is neural networks. And also, interestingly, there's not really an explicit coding of any kind of logic that's inside here. You give it data, you feed data through the system in a training step, and in a performance step, it's able to perform this kind of transformation of going from, say, French to English. Okay. And the last idea, which is even more in the weeds, okay, but I think is also really critical, is latent representations. All right. And so this is what we now kind of understand as a little bit the magic, and the thing where when people say we don't really understand what things mean inside AI, and it's leading to this idea of explainable AI, that's because of these things here, latent representations, which is basically the transformed versions of the input data that are mapped into what's called like a lower dimensional space. Again, some of these words here, if you're not of this field, may be a little obtuse, but let me show you another picture. So I said that inside of the boxes of the transformer, there were these encoders and decoders, and there was these neural networks. So if we make that a little bit more explicit, and we go inside the box one more time, and we look at what's going on between the encoders and the decoders as we give it inputs and we get out outputs, right? The latent representation is essentially what is learned in between the encoder and the decoder. At the end of the day, it's numbers that are stored inside files, really, that make up weights of this input layer. But what's possible to encode there are clusters inside arbitrary data. And as it applies to life sciences, being able to potentially do things like predict a drug response or predict a perturbation when you might, say, modify something in a cell and see what comes out. Now, some of these things are more speculative and are still being worked on in terms of academia, but the things that can be learned inside this latent representation are themselves kind of data and some way of understanding the world. The challenge is that when you open these things up and look at them as a human, they don't mean anything to us. They're just like series of numbers or what we call vectors or tensors inside them, which makes them kind of mysterious. But why we know that it's learning something valuable is their performance, because they are able to do this transformation step at a very high level of fidelity. Okay, so those are the 3 main concepts. And to kind of tie it together, okay, this is kind of the summary piece to take out of this. So foundation models leverage transformers for their architecture and often produce latent representations as part of their processing. Okay, so that's, I think, if you have these 3, if you're armed with these 3 concepts, you're going to be in a good position to better understand where we're going in AI and the life sciences, okay? Because these 3 concepts are going to be applicable no matter what we apply them to in the life sciences. So I'm going a little long, so I'm just going to flash this on the screen. I'm not going to read this and go through this, but this is an additional comparison of foundation models, transformers, and latent representations that I'll let you guys like come back to in the recording afterwards. But because I've kind of touched on the main points. But what I do want to go through is this. So if we just to review, so foundation models in the context of language are things like ChatGPT, Claude, Llama. Again, those are really the products, but what I'm talking about is the model underneath those that these services leverage. But in terms of transformers, right, for language models, there's sort of this one fundamental architecture that I showed you. And there's some differences in what data you put into it, and there's some differences in what rules that you have, but fundamentally, that transformer thing stays the same. And the latent representations in the context of language, we understand it to be encoding some kind of semantic or syntactic information of text, but again, they're not explainable. They're a series of numbers, right? That's the latent representation in terms of language. In terms of images, there are things that are popular in the space like DALL-E or Midjourney. You may have seen these AI-generated images, and now, you know, we're moving on to AI-generated audio and speech and AI-generated video, right? But the foundation model in images are things like DALL-E and Midjourney. In the transformers in images are, again, fundamentally, the architecture is the same. The difference is what data you feed into it and what learning rules you ask it to have. But the latent representation in the context of images is some kind of visual information, again, encoded into these compact informative vector spaces. And finally, though, and this is where we're going to, you know, lead off into you know, the context of biology here. So what are these foundation models going to look like, you know, in the context of biology? There already are some that are starting to pop up. And given what I've talked to you about today, you'll know that we've been using transformers not just to make language models or not just to make image models, but we're using transformers to start to build foundation models of genomics, of proteomics, of things that are relevant to drug discovery, personalized medicine, and diagnostics. Many of these things are much earlier days, right? But there are, for example, and you can find these with web searches, things like, given a DNA sequence, right, what protein would come out, right? And trying to build that kind of a transformer. And since you're now armed with the idea of what latent representations are, you'll also understand that under the hood, again, there's some learning of these essential features of biological data, but it's challenging to get them to be explainable, okay? But we do know that they can have very, very effective performance, as what we see with ChatGPT. So what I kind of want to leave you with the idea of here, going back to Winston, going back to the roots where I started my journey in AI, is that, you know, what can we do in the biology and life science space when we maybe let go of the need to encode these first order logic and data representations for concepts and causality? I think it was very useful for us to get to this stage in AI where we realized that story summarization was important, that we tried, you know, to use these explicit representations to encode them. But what we've discovered through technological innovation is that actually latent representation seem to be an even more powerful way to get the kind of performance that is you know, near human level performance on these different things. So what other rules can we let go of? Rules, you know, that we've been holding on to in these explicit spaces for a while. We've just observed a couple things here as we do get into biology, and this will be my last slide, and then we'll go into panelists. But the main challenges that folks run into when they're working on these machine learning and AI projects, especially in the biology space, starts with the lack of data, okay? This is the biggest challenge still of well-organized data and quantity of data, right? Because in the life sciences, we suffer from the fact that we don't have, you know, petabytes of text like exist on the internet, right? And we don't have petabytes of images like we have on the internet. That's why those spaces have gone so much further, right, in building these models. Instead, we have data sets that are much smaller and that are much more peculiar, if you will. And this is true in, you know, neuroscience especially. So when I came into graduate school, I was very bullish on the ability to take all the data that was there and assemble it into amazing models, only to discover that, you know, there was still a challenge in doing that. And we've taken lots of leaps and bounds on improving this, but in the domains that you're working on, I would ask you to think through, you know, how do we actually assemble the data together most effectively that you're most interested in doing generative AI with? I think this is kind of the biggest thing. So a good AI strategy rests on a good data management strategy. There's also been coming back to the LLM space, concerns about data security. Obviously, these are challenges that people run into in the LLM case and probably will continue to run into as additional AI applications come to bear. There's also, we realize there's poor collaboration. So when teams work together in silos, that prevents projects from advancing to production, and that's been just a practical challenge that's worth mentioning. It gets us into the space of what's practical in industry contexts. We find that folks don't leverage the cloud as effectively as they could, because when you're trying to assemble these large amounts of data, what you really need is a very good way to assemble data from lots of different sources and put them into a single place, and that's what the cloud's really good for. We find that when folks are getting in there and tuning and tweaking transformers, there's a shortage of in-house expertise in that. And then finally, that leads to sort of poor outcomes. So ultimately, there's a lot of promise here. There's a lot of great, theoretical things that we can do. There's a very interesting set of technologies that are emerging in the biology and life sciences space. But these sort of things are the headwinds that we have to face as we try to take these great technologies and apply them into the various areas of life sciences. Okay, thank you so much, for listening to this. I'd like to now open one more poll up for you to make this a little bit interactive as we're reaching the halfway point here. And so I'm going to ask our behind-the-scenes wizard to set up our second poll, which I think should be flashing on the screen too. Okay, great. So again, since I think LLMs is the most accessible technology here, I just like to ask you, how often do you use large language models? Which I'm meaning the commercially available ones in your work, right? Do you use it nearly every day? Do you use it once a week? Do you use it once a month, or never, less frequently? Going to give you guys a few seconds to do that voting. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, all right, very interesting. All right, so there's a very interesting 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 breakdown here. So a third of you are using LLMs nearly every day in your work. A third of you are using them about once a week. And then another whole third of you have never used them or use them much less frequently, okay? And then there's an extra like 10% group here, a tiny group that uses them once a month. So yeah, I don't know what that means, but I think it's just interesting where we are right now as, I guess the thing to say about the group that's assembled here today around you, we as an organization serve industries across drug discovery and pharma, healthcare, biotech, nonprofit, and academia. And so this audience is really consisting of a group across that whole area. So I suppose later we'll have to figure out if there's a particular breakdown across industry here, but there's definitely an interesting amount of adoption that's happening with these technologies in a short time. Okay, so I've spoken quite a lot. I'm going to now be quiet, and I'm going to allow our next speaker to introduce this slide.
All right, so I think this is my slide. So in my 5 minutes, I just wanted to get across two sort of ideas. One of them is that, of course, AI has been here for over 70 years. And so many of the ideas and technologies that we are using today come from technologies that were developed 30, 40, 50 years ago. So starting, for example, in the 60s, 70s, these perceptrons were developed, this idea of the neural networks that are the basis for deep learning, for example, and transformers. And what's I thought was interesting to mention is these historic events that happened that were called the AI winters. And so there's supposed to be 2 AI winters in the 70s, 80s, 90s also, where there was this massive hype of, AI is going to solve everything and so on. And then disappointment came, criticism. This was followed by cuts in funding for many projects and so on. And this happened twice at least, because basically the AI didn't achieve what was promised, right? So I think we are now in a third kind of wave of AI, explosion and boom and excitement, which personally, I think it's bigger than the previous ones and more promising. So I think this probably started with the changes in the availability of big data and computing, so GPUs, HPCs, and so on, that made these previous technologies much larger, and that seemed to provide much better results. So actually, when I started my PhD 20 years ago, these deep learning ideas were starting. With Hinton, for example, he published one of the key papers and so on. But during my PhD, I was using these kind of models, and I was doing a mix between neuroscience and machine learning. But at the time, it wasn't clear at all that this was going to be like a super massive, successful technology and so on. So I actually went through the route of neuroscience instead of AI, which maybe I think now was a bad choice. But but what I think is interesting is I wasn't really impressed and captivated by this technology until a more recent talk. I think it was in 2017 at SFN, at the Society for Neuroscience meeting, and this was a talk by Hasabi, the sort of CEO of DeepMind, and he was talking about this technology, AlphaGo and AlphaZero. And that was, I remember it very distinctly, the first time I thought like, wow, okay, so maybe this AI thing can actually be smarter than humans and do stuff that we cannot really do. So before, yeah, we had some stuff that, beat chess players and so on. But this new AlphaGo technology was beating at a game called Go, which is a Chinese, very ancient game, much more complex than chess, with hundreds of different possibilities in each move. And even the human players don't really know how to explain how to move in this game. What the decisions they make, they say it's kind of intuitive. So you have like these grandmasters that have been playing for all their life and for many generations, and they cannot really explain how they decide the moves. So it was funny because this AlphaGo, in a televised match, like over 100 million people watching, it beat the main grandmaster at this game. And during the game, it was making a move that it seemed didn't make sense. So the commentators were saying, what the hell is this AI doing? That doesn't make sense. And so this opening is gonna lose. And then it turned out it was a new kind of opening that no human had ever thought about in thousands of years, and which was better than the previous one that we knew about. And so for me, that sort of clicked in, like, this is like a really new way of thinking that humans cannot reach somehow, and that is better. So yeah, and interestingly, they developed then this AlphaZero version, which was even less trained than the AlphaGo version, so less trained on known human moves, but more starting from scratch, just playing against itself. And that turned out to beat the AlphaGo version almost always. So the less we input our preconceptions as humans, the better the system is. And so, of course, then the sort of next step was these generative AI and transformers that were just described. I think there's a slight hype with this, and we're going to see, a slight decrease and then a plateau. I think still, this is a massive technology, but the fact that it seems it's text-based and we feel that the thing we're interacting with is almost human, gives us a bit of a sensation that it's smarter than it actually is. It's not really reasoning as we think. It's just essentially generating the best next word possible. So you give it a series of words and it predicts the best next word. That's all it does. There's a lot of technologies around it that make it a bit more useful, but that's what it does right now. And then the other idea I wanted to show, if we go to the next slide, is this interaction with neuroscience, between neuroscience and AI. So my field is neuroscience, and so I think this is interesting because it goes both ways. So on the one hand, we know many of these AI technologies have been inspired by neuroscience. So deep learning or convolutional neural networks, they really are derived from this idea of the visual system, these simple and complex cells that are organized hierarchically in the visual system, from the primary visual cortex to other regions. And so from there, these ideas were converted into this artificial system that is basically the top technology for vision or auditory detection and so on. And even transformers, which have this idea of attention, is also derived from attentional mechanisms in the brain. The other big technology that is being used is reinforcement learning, and that is also derived from the brain, right? One key advance that I didn't mention is this AlphaFold application, which is, a practical application of this AlphaGo that I was talking about. Uses deep learning and this reinforcement learning, and it really has uncovered this 200 million folding of proteins, which was an unsolved problem in biology, which was predicted to take hundreds of years to solve, and it's now solved thanks to this technology, and can lead to drug discovery and so on. And so the other way around also, of course, artificial intelligence, AI, has been used in neuroscience for many years, and now it's also spiking up, and we see it's a key technology for everything we do in neuroscience. From all these massive data sets that are emerging right now, we need to understand them, categorize them, interpret them, and AI is key. So here I'm just showing an example of this clustering dimensionality reduction techniques that Stephen mentioned, and these are used, for example, to classify the genomics, the genetics, transcriptomics of different cell types in the brain, and that is a massive advance in today's neuroscience. And also for the stuff that I do, building these very detailed models of the brain, we use AI all the time for the last 20 years to optimize the parameters using algorithms and so on. So I think this interaction is really interesting, and it goes both ways, and I think this is going to be a key in the future as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Alva. Let's go on to our next speaker.
That's right. Silva already presented this a little bit, because I thought, given our conversations we had before this webinar, that Stephen wanted us to talk about, are we using this, and is it ready for prime time? What are we using it for? And when I gave you my introduction, and Stephen actually showed a little bit this in his life cycle, that said, I'd been in informatics for a very, very long time. And the basic motivation for me to go into informatics was the recognition, as every neuroscientist should have, is that you are not going to solve the brain and behavior one molecule, one gene, one cell, one brain region at a time, right? That neuroscience is the ultimate data integration challenge. It dwarfs our ability as humans to do this. And therefore, without the help of computers, we aren't going to really be able to get very far. And so in my career, we've attacked data on the two sides. One is, data has to be put into a form where it is computable or usable or fair. I mentioned the fair data principles. And Stephen mentioned that that's one of the big problems that we have right now, is we don't have enough of it. The skills for managing and preparing data just don't reside in the neuroscience community. That's why my group spends so much time on these big projects, helping with curation, trying to organize the data, align it to standards, all of those types of things. And we all know that that is a huge help to any sort of AI algorithm. And sorry, that was my cat. And a good way to be able, that if we really want to use computers to be able to compute on this, it needs this data. And I would say that my experience with AI, generative models, NLP, machine learning, has been mostly on the side of, can it help us with this process of preparing data, organizing data, annotating data, right? Because that is one of the main things that we do. And very early on, we've been really working on this for as long as I've been in neuroscience, which is now about 30, 40 years at this point. Somebody presented me the hype curve, which I loved so much. It seemed to me that it represented a universal truth. I found out that this was actually from a company called Gartner, and Silva mentioned some of these, right? That throughout my career, I've seen several of these technology triggers. There's this peak of inflated expectations. There is the crash after it realized that just can't be used for this, the slope of enlightenment, where you start to realize, hey, it actually can be used for this. And then the plateau of productivity, where you actually start to employ it in places where you can be productive. And I think it is illustrative in my career that being on the sort of data inside, if you will, the data preparation side and the analysis side, I sort of noticed that there are really two different sets of requirements. When you're talking about preparing data, building knowledge graphs, doing all of that, you're in the mode really of a company, right? You need to be able to do things. You need to be able to do them reliably. You need to be able to do them on a time schedule because other people are relying on you to get this sort of thing done. And so also throughout my career, I've always worked in conjunction with computer scientists and programmers, and they would watch me do something very painstaking. They're like, I can write a program for you, and that will do that in 10 minutes. And I said, great. 2 years later, I get the program, and then 10 years later, the bugs are out. And meanwhile, my grant's over, right? I've already published my papers. I've already done it. So if you want to use these things in production, they have to be reliable, they have to be robust, and they have to save you more work or do it substantially better than you could do it yourself. And there's been a lot of push by NIH and other funders because, of course, people are expensive. And right now, most of this work is very people intensive to try to get that replaced with some of these large language models. And thus far, the human expert still beats the large language model. You have to spend so much time correcting it that you really don't, you don't save any time, and you wouldn't necessarily rely on what it was that you got. On the other side, though, is once you have that data and you're analyzing it, as Silva says, you really want it to look for things that you don't know. We don't want to limit these things based on what humans know and think, because clearly, as far as the brain is concerned, everything we know is wrong, right? So, I mean, we're not there yet. So on the other side, machine learning and some of these other types of advanced analysis tools are starting to show things that we simply could not see before. The question is, are they correct or not? And that's the problem. We're in discovery science. So you don't know whether it gives you the right answer. It generates a ton of hypotheses for you, though. And that's always useful in science, right? So there's really this sort of split. And I would say certainly what I'm starting to see in the analysis domain is, yes, right, this is here to stay. And this is, right, it's able to handle complexities on scales that we simply can't handle. Whether we'll know how to interpret them or we'll recognize them as correct, like in the example with Go, I don't know yet. But I do think, and you can show my next slide here, and this is a quote that actually, when I was a teenager, there was a great movie critic in Long Island where I grew up, and he had all these great quotes. And one of his quotes was, which I use in technology development all the time, but the screen talked. And what he meant was he was talking about one of the very first talkies, or the first talkie. Terrible movie, terrible production values, terrible acting, terrible everything. But the screen talked, and you realized that movies were never going to go back, and that all these other things were going to get better, and that this was a transformational time. And when I first saw what ChatGPT was, even though I was laughing at its various, faux pas and other sorts of things, you also recognized that this was also something that was fundamentally different, even though it may just be an evolution of everything that was going on. And I have been advising my students and others is that you really do need to understand it, because it is going to impact everything, and it is going to impact our way of doing science simply because human beings are so limited in what they're going to be able to do just with sort of the simple statistical paradigms and things that we've already had. I think nature is so integrated and so interactive that the whole paradigm that we had of splitting the body up and splitting our funding up and splitting everything up, our journals up into these little silos, is going to go away, because it has to. It's not the way the body works. And everything that we see so far is allowing us now almost to go back to looking at the whole organism instead of starting to divide it up. And I think that, some of the AI and things are going to show us the way. So those are just my thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and let's round this out with our final speaker for the intro content.
Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, I'm really excited to, talk about some of these use cases that Salvador and Marianne talked about. And I would like to believe that in the Gartner hype cycle, maybe realistically we're in the peak of, inflated expectation. But hopefully we're in that slope of enlightenment, implementing these technologies. So some of the, I can't go in more details because of the, privacy and that sort of the GXP regulations and that kind of sort of regulations around pharma and my company privacy policy. But I can give you a brief overview of what we're using AI in our company and other participating companies that we have. Microsoft is one of the tools that we use, and it has different models that we've been able to leverage in our company. I specifically work for commercialization of the products that we've come up with inside Genmab. So one of the use cases that we've done is for data tracking. We have a large amount of clinical trial data and patient data. So we're using AI to kind of track the data and trying to understand, the patient identification and also the patient recruitment areas of the company. Since we work on producing antibody therapeutics, it's very important for us to understand what kind of diseases these patients have. And personalized treatment plans is, something you hear a lot, and that's something we are working on as well. There's genomic analysis, there's adaptive treatment algorithms that we're using AI to, leveraging AI for. Another field is also the risks tracking and assessment. And obviously the different trials that we are performing, we are using AI to track these trials and see what are the risks, what are the benefits, and how we can change course depending on the risk and rewards of these trials. Obviously, the third point is trial execution. And finally, a really cool thing that I would like to talk about is the translation tool, which I'm a little bit more involved in. And this is more not only for pharma, but also I think any multinational company is facing. Translation is, if you're a multinational company and you have a set of plans and procedures, translation of these languages are very, very expensive right now. So this is a very simple use case, but also a very needed use case that will save company a lot of money and, also make the procedures easy to understand and more fluid for different languages. So this is also a big project that we're currently working on to, make sure that our processes and training materials and also the data that we generate are properly translated. Currently, we are, based in Denmark, Netherlands, America, and Japan, and also in China with the new acquisition that we just did. So we're using AI to kind of translate these different trial informations, patient information, and training materials, and try to save some money and also create smooth procedures within the company.
Awesome. Thank you, Rama. Thank you to all the speakers. So we have a few questions coming in, and I'll go ahead and read off a couple. We're now transitioning into the Q&A section, so those of you who are in get to have first dibs of questions you'd like to ask. But the first question that I'll read out is, well, it starts off, thank you for putting this event together. You're welcome. Regarding risks and personal privacy, are existing risk frameworks sufficient, or are you finding the need to build out new privacy protocols for generative AI? And I think that's kind of for everybody in the room. Maybe think about it. I know, obviously, folks in the academic space are going to tend to operate with data that are less under privacy protocols, but I'm sure they'll have some things to say about that as well. On the industry side, obviously, the regulations like GDPR in Europe and HIPAA in the States were written before generative AI, and we're seeing the modern generative AI lead to lots of concerns after the fact. A very famous case, has been the New York Times suing OpenAI. I think that's still ongoing for the fact that they, believe that they trained all their, that they trained on a large corpus of New York Times articles. And there's, I think, going to be a fair question there about, even though all that data, was accessible, does it violate some policy to use it? So I guess I'd ask the panel to think through, if we see that analogy in large language models and ChatGPT, right? There's similar concerns on the side of artists and the image generation models, where even though those images were available for humans to look at with no problem, now that AIs have been trained on things that humans were freely available to look at, there's concern that shouldn't have been trained on there. So are there additional worries in the life science space that folks have maybe come across that, maybe data that was perfectly fine to be available beforehand, now because you can train a model on it, suddenly there's additional concern? Thoughts, panelists?
Salva, if you have something to say. I was just going to say that I think even without, very heavy duty, fancy AI, I mean, true de-identification is virtually impossible. And one of the things is exactly what you said, since AI is an integrative tool. I mean, it summarizes, it looks for patterns, it tries to do these. And the more things you have about an individual, the easier it is to identify them, right? I didn't think it took somebody very long when they tried to identify people from Netflix profiles, because the minute you have things out there, right, you can start to do that sort of correlation. So, I think in other areas, you're just having the wars of the AIs, right? The things that also may protect against that is that, we can use the same types of tools to sort of gauge re-identification risk. But the issue of sort of privacy and online privacy, trust, all kinds of things, I think now are being impacted hugely by AI. And that, I think, is almost as much of a problem as the typical privacy problems. It's that you don't know who you're talking to anymore, right? And you don't know where data comes from, and you don't know where papers come from, right? I mean, those are all also, I think, some big, gigantic things, at least for academia. Anything that relies on some sort of factual information, where you do consider the source, I think is going to be a problem.
Just quickly to mention, we're putting together several projects on these foundational models that include, data from clinical data from patients and so on. And it's a massive issue, all these HIPAA regulations. It's not clear if we can use it or not. So it definitely is a big issue to think about.
Okay. Next question from audience member. This one's specifically for Rama. How do you balance the excitement for AI saving time and the worry that AI-based translation and tracking tools might make costly mistakes for commercialization?
That's definitely a very valid question, Joyce. Thank you. So definitely there is this concern, right, that there could be possible mistake, especially when you're doing a large volume of document translations and the procedure translations. There can be some mistakes. So one rule of thumb which folks who use AI already know is there always needs to be a human interaction or a human validation at the end of the use of AI. So that's also something that we're following in our industry. And also, when you're using tools from Microsoft, there is also a certification that they provide. So this has X amount of accuracy. So based on that accuracy as well, we can, dial up or down our human checkpoint for these different translation. But at the end of the day, it's our personal responsibility as humans to kind of double check the work that AI has produced. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Question for Marianne. Says, I like the story you had about non-production quality software being worse in the long run compared to manual effort. Do you think that there is a space for AI to help solve the disorganized data problem, or do you think that still needs to be a manual process?
That is a very good question because, I mean, clearly data, especially data where we have this, there is an effort now for common data elements and things which help you code in constraints and things that, you know, data has to follow. Like you would think that that would lend itself very well to computers looking at it and going, hey, right, is this good data, bad data? Is it organized properly? But the problem with the number is that most numbers are just numbers, and right, looking at them going, is this correct, incorrect? Is it organized in an efficient way? Is actually very difficult, right, to do. The other thing about data, which really becomes apparent when you try to put a publication model on top of data, where you're like, well, it's kind of like publishing a paper, but papers are all very, right, language is language. You can tell if language is nonsensical because the words aren't put together in a way where you can get meaning from them. And they're all roughly around the same size, right? They're small, and they are all, at least if they're a scientific paper, all organized exactly the same way, pretty much, right? You don't even need to look at the headings to know, here's an introduction, here's the methods, here's the results, and here's the conclusions. And when you get data and you look at these data sets, they're all over the place, right? They can be organized in an infinite number of ways. The numbers can have all different kinds of meaning depending on what it is that people do. So I do believe that there are things, however, because you can train an expert to look at it and know something about it, right? That there are clearly patterns that one looks for. Again, I think having standards really helps because a standard tells you something about how things need to be organized, and it either is or it is not. So I think it may be more difficult than we think just because of the diversity of it. But I don't think it is impossible, and I think it is sorely needed, right? I do really believe that one of the places where I'm really hoping, and it's not sexy, right? It's not a sort of a sexy thing that's driving it, but really giving much better data management tools, right? Clues as to whether something is right or wrong, or, you know, off in some way or not efficiently organized. I can't imagine that those are intractable. But I will say something that I think is very interesting. It turns out, and Salva, you know this from our various conversations, one of the hardest things for NLP to deal with in the scientific literature or any literature is tables. You would think it would be the easiest because tables are already organized, but it turns out to be one of the hardest for multiple reasons. And the state of the art is still not very good unless you say, hey, this is a table. So I do kind of think that data may end up being a little more difficult than we suspect.
Awesome. Well, everyone, we are at time. So thank you. There were a few more questions that we did not get a chance to get to. But Marianne, Salvador, Rama, thank you so much for your time illuminating all of us here on where we're going with this crazy world of AI in the life sciences. Audience, thank you very much for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you have additional questions or thoughts about AI in the life sciences, please follow up with us. Feel free to directly reach out to anybody on the panel, or feel free to get in touch with me myself. My email is steven@metacell.us. Happy to talk through more of these use cases with you as we go. It's a bright future, but not one without its challenges. So we really appreciate you thinking through this with all of us. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.